There was a lot of interesting evidence collected in this case, including gun casings and a laptop found at the bottom of the Martins pool. I'm joined now by criminal defense investigator Charles Mittelstadt. He's here to explain how forensics and ballistics and lots of factors can make or break an investigation. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Dan.
I want to talk about a couple items at the crime scene and get your take on them. First of all, I want to talk about cuts. We've seen deep wounds of some kind on the defendant's hand. What can cuts tell us at a crime scene like this?
Well, you know, given the nature of this case, Danny, where you have two competing versions as to what happened, I mean, it's a classic he said, she said. You know, this is where the physical evidence and the scientific evidence becomes so critical in trying to determine exactly what happened. And so these wounds can be defensive in nature, or they could be offensive, aggressive in nature. And so the very placement of these wounds, whether you're able to determine what kind of a weapon, if that's consistent with the knife that was recovered in this case, was used to inflict those particular injuries, that's the significance.
Now, Charles, this is why you get paid the big bucks, because you observed something about the sneaker in this case that I found compelling. Tell me about the sneakers in this case and why they're important.
Well, Christy's version of the events was that she was in the process of putting her sneakers on to go for a run. And that's when the defendant in this case came in and essentially committed the first offense, which was repeatedly stabbing her in the abdomen. And so the fact that this Good Samaritan that found her on the roadway corroborates that when he found her, she only had one sneaker on. And that the crime scene investigation also documents the fact that there was only one sneaker present in the house, in the bedroom, consistent with what she is saying about where that was.
Well, not only that, but the theory that who would initiate a fight with one sneaker on, isn't that would be a
exactly.
compelling theory for the prosecution in this case, that one sneaker, which is something that's something you could just overlook very easily if you aren't trained to look for that. I want to talk about blood spatter. What can blood spatter tell us about a crime at a crime scene?
Well, again, Christy had some very severe, life-threatening injuries in this case. You're talking about incised wounds inflicted by a sharp edge, a knife in this case. And so, in those kinds of injuries, you have blood spatter that frequently occurs, where, unfortunately, is unpleasant as it may be. Literally, blood is spraying in some cases, and there are patterns that form. And these patterns, the shape and the direction of blood spatter can reveal a lot about the location of the victim, of the defendant when these injuries were inflicted, and in terms of how the injury occurred, in terms of which direction. And it's very, very revealing. Obviously, I'm not a blood spatter expert, but to those who are, it's very, very telling indeed. And then again, in a case like this, where we have two competing versions, or we have essentially a mutual combat defense, it's really, really revealing to be able to look at that and read into what happened at that scene.
Okay, gunshot residue, or GSR as we call it. A lot of people don't know, it's amazing technology. Tiny particles come out of the breech of the gun and get on people's hand. Why wasn't gunshot residue more of a factor in this case?
Well, in this case, the defendant was only apprehended, from what I recall, about a week after the event. And so during that week period, the defendant had an opportunity to bathe and change clothing, and so the likelihood that GSR would be still present was very, very slim, and so my understanding is there was no GSR test even conducted. Now, because of the competing versions, it would have been beneficial to determine whether the victim in this case had any residue as well. Now, it's also important to note, Danny, that the absence of gunshot residue doesn't necessarily mean that that person did not fire the weapon.
It could mean they took a shower, which is exactly what James Martin is alleged to have done.
It could mean they took a shower, but even in the absence of a shower, sometimes it really has a lot to do with the weapon, how it discharges, the construction of the weapon. There's a lot of factors that go into whether, how much or even if any presence of gunshot residue will exist. But again, from a defense perspective, the absence thereof doesn't necessarily mean anything. The presence thereof generally is much, much more revealing. It's very difficult to explain away gunshot residue when it's there.
Right. You made a great point about James Martin asserting a mutual combat defense. What do you look for in terms of defensive wounds, not just cuts, but otherwise?
Well, you know, this is what's interesting on paper about this case. Here you have a professional fighter. I mean, this is
a professional fighter.
Professional fighter. I mean, she is very, very capable. And then you have a defendant who's significantly older, by all accounts, relatively frail. And so on paper, it doesn't even look like it could ever be a fair fight.
Absolutely. Right? I mean, we see her there training, see some video of her training now. I mean, she'd be a match for anyone her age, let alone a 60-plus-year-old man, which we have to remember in this case, even though the evidence right now appears to point to Martin being the aggressor. What kind of defensive wounds specifically would we look for here?
Well, again, you know, based upon the victim's version, you know, the only way, and this is what the prosecution is arguing, the only way that this could even happen, because of what we just mentioned about the obvious mismatch, would be a surprise attack, really, and it would have to involve not fists but guns and knives. Yeah. And so what we're looking for is some kind of defensive wounds on the victim's hands in terms of trying to gain control of that knife.
Okay. All right. Charles Mittelstadt, as always, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
The prosecution's next witness examined the shed where the defendant was found and recovered an interesting piece of evidence.